I'm having a good reading year, and if you don't know me, my name is Jennifer and I read a lot. So I wanted to highlight the top books so far that I've read in 2026, and because I'm filming this in mid-July, there are a few books I haven't finished yet for one reason or another, but they've been excellent so far, so I'm going to start by highlighting those three. Then we'll have a little interlude for a book that was probably the worst I've read this year, but it's a special case, a special exception. We'll talk about it. And of course, I'll wrap things up with my top 3 completed books, which are so strong this time around, and they actually include one of the 5 best novels I've ever read, and I'm not exaggerating, so I hope you'll stick with me. These won't be incredibly in-depth reviews. I love making those, and I've published some recently, but this video is more in the spirit of a mid-year check-in. You know, I want to assess how things are going. When it comes to the 3 books I'm still reading, the first one I want to mention is Bede by George Eliot, and for those of you who aren't so invested in 19th century novels, I mean, I do wish I could take you out to coffee and ask you when the pain began. But Eliot was a Victorian author who's best known for the novel Middlemarch. You've probably seen it in these booktube parts, and that was from later in her career. But Bede was the first of the 7 novels she ended up publishing. I love the way Modern Library packages Eliot, especially. There's something about this combination to the point where I went out of my way to get this used copy that has seen better days. Anyway, Bede was published in 1859, but it takes place in a rural English village in 1799. And this is something that was common for Eliot, actually, to turn her novels into historical fiction, essentially, in a really explicit way. The narrator has these asides about how things used to be different back then, and how so much has changed in the village since the time of our story, which is the story of a young man named Adam and the woman he loves, who doesn't love him in the same way, let me tell you. Now, Adam is portrayed as the ideal, simple, and sophisticated rural man. He's this tall, strong carpenter who makes an impression everywhere he goes because he's sure of hand, penetrating of eye, sound of judgment, that type. The narrator's really into him, and fair enough, but you know who's not into him? The local village airhead, who also happens to be the local village beauty. You hate to see it. There was definitely a time when I would have traded being more of an airhead to be more beautiful, and that's why young people shouldn't make decisions. This is my first Eliot in a while, and God, it's just so enjoyable to read her prose, so I'm sure I'll be talking about this one a lot more extensively in the future. The same goes for In Flanders Fields, the 1917 campaign by Leon Wolff, which was published in 1958, and is kind of a classic of the World War I history genre. It follows some of the key decisions that led to Passchendaele, which was a military campaign on the Western Front that was spearheaded by Sir Douglas Haig, the head of the British Army, after the Battle of the Somme. That's the thing that still stops readers in their tracks over 100 years later, is that after the brutal futility of the Somme, we did another one, but with even more mud. That's the general narrative, at least. I'm going to be a little reductive here for the sake of brevity, and I have Nick Lloyd's more recent book on Passchendaele on my TBR for this year. It has this eyebrow-raising subtitle, The Lost Victory of World War I. Color me skeptical and very intrigued. But Wolff takes more of a journalistic approach than a historian would, and he definitely holds the most common view that this was an unbelievably ill-fated campaign and that everyone should have known that, and that plenty did and didn't stop it, or at least didn't succeed in stopping it, depending on the person. But the last thing I'll say on this is Wolff's writing is so entertaining. He's such an entertaining writer, and I think a fair amount of people have this underlying question of why read older nonfiction if newer nonfiction on the same subject has more updated sources? And believe me, Lloyd has to have better sourcing than Wolff did. Wolff wasn't super careful about that. But this attitude that the new is an improvement on the old by default also treats nonfiction like it's just a series of facts committed to paper, and like a writer's individual voice only matters in the case of fiction, and this is such a clear case of that not being true. And then the final novel where you're catching me midstream here is an event. It's a brick, the novel The Sleepwalkers by Hermann Broch, translated from German by Willa and Edwin Muir. So Broch was an Austrian writer, and incredibly, this was his first novel. It was published to completion in 1932, and I know a lot of you will think of the historian Christopher Clark's book from 2014 when you hear this title, but this 1932 Sleepwalkers, Die Schlafwandler for my German speakers, is made up of 3 novels. The Romantic, which takes place in 1888, The Anarchist in 1903, and The Realist in 1918. All 3 are set in Germany, which was a young nation at the time, and it's interesting to me that this Austrian author, instead of focusing this in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the disintegration of that empire, set it in Germany. And maybe that's because Germany as a nation still existed after 1918, but I've read the first 2 novels and I'm in the middle of the 3rd, and both The Romantic and The Anarchist have this classic 19th century novel feel and structure to them. And then The Realist features the protagonist from those prior novels and has its own dubious protagonist and takes place in the final months of the Great War. And it's essentially capturing the obliteration of narrative that this war was for writers and for entire nations. The Real is just so much more fragmented and much more of an experiment with what the novel could even be as a form after this like wrenching end to an epoch. I'm reading this for a class I'm currently taking on German and Austrian World War I writing. It's just a public class that's meeting a few times this month and I'm having the best time. I love having reading assigned, but I'm sure I'll discuss this a whole lot more in the future. Stay tuned. All right, the outlier here. So what happened is that I got a question as part of a Patreon Q&A that was a great question about if I would consider making videos on some of the more mainstream books I read. I think that is the word that was used. So I'm going to show you some of my answer for context, because it's important context for how I view romantasy and how I usually read it versus how I read the book I'm about to talk about. Here's that clip. This question really got me thinking, because the short answer here is that even though I do read a fair amount of Regency romance and dystopian YA and also romantasy books, I don't review them for the same reason I'm putting read in scare quotes, which is that I skim them. Overwhelmingly, I'm skimming these kinds of books, and that's usually the case even for the authors I admire as writers. Someone like Lisa Kleypas, for example, is someone who's just a great writer on the line level, and I've read a number of her books cover to cover. If you haven't read her before, I really recommend Love in the Afternoon. He's just returned from the Crimean War. She's been writing him secret letters under a different name. So great. But even for Kleypas, over time, I've skimmed a lot of her books because of the way these subgenres depend on formulas and by design. Formulaic isn't a criticism in this context because that's what they're supposed to be. Like, I remember seeing somebody online say something about how Fourth Wing was unoriginal, and I was like, yes, welcome. So it becomes a question of how any individual book employs formulas, and some will subvert them, but most of them won't. And subversion definitely isn't a prerequisite for a book to be successful at what it's attempting to do in this space. It's really that mixture of entirely predictable elements and a few unpredictable elements that's the appeal of reading a Regency romance or a romantasy book. I mean, if you're not out here looking for a book boyfriend, which I am not. Mostly these books give me a reason to invoke my favorite prayer of the single woman: may this kind of love never find me. But yeah, that's the balance of it not being a criticism. If a book that was always meant to be 80% predictable is 80% predictable, but then if it's going to be that way, it doesn't require my full attention to have the same effect. And honestly, a lot of romantasy individual books and series are really long, and I would just rather spend a few hours with them and like have a good time and be on my way. So for example, a lot of authors aren't that great at writing action scenes and large battle scenes or fights on the deck of a ship or something, so I'll skip those. I'll skip almost any kissing scene because it's like, yeah, okay, we're burning up, burning, never felt this way before, expert tongue action, so expert. Same with sex scenes, especially when it comes to Regency romance, because 95% of those babies are cut and paste. It's like, he's a rake who's never felt this way before, and she's a nervous virgin, and he's introducing her to the pleasures of the flesh. And truly, there are only so many virgins being introduced to the pleasures of the flesh that I need to read about in a single lifetime, you know? And okay, even when there are widows in these books, there's always this sleight of hand where it's like, the sex she had with her first husband was never actually that good. So somehow this mother of two who tragically lost her beloved husband, still has never had what our hero can provide. In romantasy, another reason I'll skim at times is there's the convention that regardless of a character's age, everyone swears like a 13-year-old. It always makes me think of how when one of my cousins and I were, I think around 12, there was this summer at the beach when we would go back to the sand dunes. Lila. There was a summer at the beach when we would go back to the sand dunes and find a quiet place to practice cursing. We called it our cursing corner. We'd look over our shoulder and be like, shit, and feel like we were being illicitly adult somehow. That's how these characters talk. Like 12-year-old Sammy and Jenny back by the sand dunes in the cursing corner. And clearly saying the word damn repeatedly is supposed to show that our 22-year-old protagonist is some kind of jaded rebel and a body can only take so much. Yeah, just like how there's a hard limit to how many thoughts I can read of the variety, like, I mean to tear my gaze away, but I can't. He's just so magnetically, majestically gorgeous. His magnetic, majestic gorgeousness has never ever been countenanced before on the face of the earth. Also, just having studied Slavic languages, it actually takes me out how many bootleg pseudo-Slavic names there are in a lot of these books, presumably to give these characters a more mysterious aura, but truly it's one of my least favorite things. And that happens all the time in this subgenre with names from other cultures too. It's just that in the Slavic case, it's viscerally funny for me. It's like in English, if a serious love interest were called Bucket, but it was spelled like Buquet, and you had to spend 500 pages reading about the male lead, Bucket with a Q. That's why I'm a pretty judicious skimmer, and as I'm saying all of this, what it's really indicating is that for romantasy especially, I'm not the target audience. I'm an interloper who occasionally is in a very specific mood for this kind of book, and these authors are gonna deliver on that mood. Thank you, queens. And I may roll my eyes over some of the formulas here, but I wouldn't be doing that if I were really the target audience, you know? It's like how an Instagram reel will pop up and I'll find it vaguely grating, and then a few seconds in, I'll realize that the target audience is definitely someone who's younger than I am. And I don't have some unique right for everyone to be speaking in the way that's most appealing to me. You know, the internet isn't only for me. Books aren't only for me. That's the gist of why I don't often end up reviewing these books I interact with a lot at different points throughout the year, because it's just not fair to review a book I haven't read. I mean, clearly not. What happened is I filmed that video last week and that question inspired me. I was like, why don't I commit to reading a romantasy book instead of skimming it, just to see what it's like and just to prolong the fun, you know? And boy, was that fun prolonged, because I chose a book several friends had recommended to me. It's called Quicksilver by Callie Hart. And look, I wasn't expecting this to be Bleak House. One eyeful of this amazing cover and you pretty much know what you're getting into. But the thing is, I had such a wild reading experience because I kept thinking it was avoiding certain standards of the genre and that it was going in a slightly different direction. And then one by one, every single genre domino fell. And it took so long for some of them to fall. Long enough that I was able to lie to myself. I was like, okay, she's not going to do that to me at this point. Like, no, she wouldn't. And I'm here to say she would, and she did, very slowly and very surely. I'm sure by the end of this non-review there will be a spoiler or two for Quicksilver, so you've been warned. You can skip to the next section if you want to, but I think most of you won't care. So this follows a girl named Saris who lives in the poorest part of a desert-based city. Some parts of the city are extravagantly wealthy, but in her part, food is scarce and water is rationed on a daily basis. And that's why the book opens with her stealing something incredibly valuable. She has this dream that she and her brother might not have to struggle so much anymore, but instead, stealing this object leads to her arrest. And that ultimately leads to her being unexpectedly transported to this magical icy mountain kingdom. And you want to guess who transports her there? The guy on the cover, Death himself, because he needs the powers of alchemy she didn't know she had. Unironically, what a great start. Here's the thing. I did think, based on the very first part of the book, that this would be more on the edgy side and that this protagonist would be a little bit more of an actual badass instead of someone a 14-year-old would think is a badass, and that's no shade to 14-year-olds. Who's cool at that age? No one. And thank God, because they're going through enough without that being an expectation. But yeah, the main character is 24, and she felt mostly 24 at the beginning and decently self-possessed. And then she went to the Mountain Kingdom and Girly Pop's brain fell out of her skull and she was literally and figuratively tripping over herself for this man. And God bless, I couldn't tell you what he saw in her or what she saw in him, to be fair, but it was a protracted series of interactions that were almost banter, almost. And I would say halfway through, my sunk cost fallacy really went into overdrive. I was like, I committed to this experiment, and you know what? At least Miss Callie Hart still hasn't made these people mates, which is such a thing in this subgenre. If you're not familiar, a lot of you are probably like, what is happening right now? But mate bonds, I'm having this surreal moment of explaining this. They're this combination of people being soulmates and predestined, possessive, obsessive, animalistic mates, okay? But Callie hadn't done that to me. There was one domino standing. Now picture me after hours, like so many hours, crawling to the finish line of this book and seeing that these characters, who each individually had the charisma of a mailbox and who had no chemistry for hundreds of pages, like the chemistry of corpses that had been accidentally dumped in the same grave, that these people weren't just mates. They were the ultimate mates. The uber mates. The scream I scrubbed.
Together, we were beginning to get over this dark patch. There was light at the end of the tunnel. We're this! We're this! How about that?
I felt my already tenuous connection to sanity snap. With like a cartoonish sound of a carrot snapping, something inside me was severed. And what came out of me was a scream of genuine agony. And then I couldn't stop laughing. I was laughing my ass off that I'd had such good intentions and had read every word of this book. And we still ended with them being fucking mates.
We're this! We're this! How about that?
This is what I was like. Holy shit. This is what I was like. It's too much. It was too much. So I think I chose the wrong book for this experiment, and it is emblematic of a lot of what goes on in the genre, but there are characters who are written much better than these, you know? So if you have any recommendations for attempt number 2 to read every word of a book like this, let me know. Yeah, that was the worst book I read this year and I had a great time. Without further ado, there's been much ado about very little. Here are my top 3 books so far, going up to the tippity top. So number 3 is She Who Remains by Rene Karabash, translated from Bulgarian by Izidora Angel. If you watched my international booker reviews, you won't be surprised to see this probably. It was my favorite of the 4 books I read from the list, and I was really swept up by the unusual and unaffected prose style. Karabash is a poet and her prose is poetic, and I go into more detail in the full review as to what I mean by that in this context. It's a kind of poetry that feels grounded in the reality of the book's protagonist, the very harsh reality of Matija, who lives alone in the mountains of northern Albania, and who recounts how he was born a woman named Byeeeee, a boy-like girl with a brother who was considered a disappointment because he was a girl-like boy. But an older Byeeeee eventually avoided marriage in the only way she could, by becoming a sworn virgin. And by the laws of something called the Qanun of northern Albania, a sworn virgin becomes a man overnight. So if you want to hear more, I go into blood feuds and katare and the classical Greek undertones here, all that. And it's just a book I'm still thinking about. Number 2 is a nonfiction book called Budapest, Portrait of a City Between East and West by Victor Sebestyen. I've owned this since it was published in 2022, and it makes me so glad that I read my TBR, because it's not like I didn't expect this to be good. That's why I own it. But I didn't expect it to be So good. So Sebestyen is a journalist whose family is from Hungary. They actually fled Hungary in 1956. If you watch my video on Magda Szabó's books, you'll be hearing a ping with 1956. And actually, this is a great place to go if you're interested in Hungarian history after that video. But those details I just mentioned made me a little bit wary going into this because I love reading journalists in addition to historians, but sometimes there can be that style over substance thing going on, like you could possibly claim for the Wolff. And also, Sebestyen's family background is obviously a strength, but it also made me wonder if we'd be getting a hagiography of Budapest, you know, a portrait of a city loved and lost. But really, he has such a nice balance of engaging storytelling, really engaging, and substantive information that he presents critically too. And there's a lot of nuance in here that's not equivocal to the point of saying nothing. I saw pretty quickly that he feels a strong connection to the subject matter, but you're not getting a romanticized Budapest here. And what I admire about this is the whole construction of it. He takes you from the period of the Romans, like 550 BC, all the way up to 1989, and the way he breaks up the subject matter feels right, the length of the chapters feels right, the level of detail, and then the line level writing is strong, and I consistently felt invested in where he was going to take me. And those sorts of things are all simple to observe, but they're not easy to execute. And this portrayal of Budapest and Hungarian history more broadly is filled with these great characters. I think he's smart to focus on them, and he does tell larger social stories around these figures. But there was something about this book that just made me remember why there's that crossover between history readers and epic fantasy readers, because those genres can scratch a similar itch. You're reading about kings and sultans and empresses and engineers and poets and merchants, and why each one of these people was an era-defining figure. Like, who's going to write the epic fantasy about the court of Matthias Corvinus, the actual Raven King of the 15th century who had this opulent court and this incredible library that was then sacked, you know? And that's just one of the people in here. And then, of course, you get the general trajectory of so many interesting and varied periods of Ottoman rule, the Habsburg era, the revolution of 1848, 1867, and the dual monarchy when it became Austria-Hungary, the general high highs and low lows of the Jewish population of Budapest, the Great War, of course, the Holocaust and World War II, communism, and again, in a way that just balances my two favorite things, rigor and approachability. There was a book I featured heavily last year, From Peoples into Nations by John Connolly, which was this big history of Eastern Europe. And I mentioned how you could feel lost reading it if you weren't already familiar with the history of Eastern Europe, but that's not the case here. So for my history readers out there, this is a strong recommendation, and that includes those of you who are just getting into reading history titles. That leads me to number one. The best book I've read this year is The House of Mirth by Edith Wharton, and it's almost freeing that I can't express the full genius of this book after only reading it once. And I would say I felt its greatness more than I could fully express it at this point. And this is what I do, you know, I read and I think about what makes books work, and still sometimes you just have an experience that's on a different level from what you're used to. It's like someone who studies painting or art history going to a gallery and suddenly seeing a painting that just captures why they love this thing at all, like why their mind returns to it, why their heart returns to it. If you're not that familiar with Edith Wharton, she was the turn-of-the-century American writer who was born into a very wealthy family. She grew up in a brownstone in Manhattan in the latter half of the 19th century, and she published her first novel in 1902 at the age of 40, which is a detail I've always loved about her career. And I would say she's best known for her novel The Age of Innocence, which came later in the 1920s. If you've watched the HBO show The Gilded Age, a lot of that is inspired by the kind of portraits of the era we have in Wharton's work, this idea of old New York, that oxymoron, and the rigid and intricate social hierarchies among the city's elite in that fin de siècle era. The House of Mirth was her second novel. It was published in 1905, and it was what made her name because it just sold like hotcakes and was reviewed everywhere. And it wasn't just the elites who were reading this, because what you have here is a dramatic story that features one of the great literary characters. Her name is Lily Bart, and the thing about Lily is that she's 29, she's both gorgeous and socially adept, and she's unmarried in an age when being a spinster was highly undesirable. So immediately it's like, what's going on there? And critically, her financial situation is a lot more precarious than that of her peers. So it's not like she's single because she can live comfortably without marrying into money. She's also vain. She loves luxurious living. She wants to stay in this social circle, but she keeps sabotaging herself when it comes to marriage. Repeatedly, she can't make herself go through the whole performance of landing a life with these men she knows in her heart are worthless as people. Here's a good moment of that. She had been bored all afternoon by Percy Gryce. The mere thought seemed to waken an echo of his droning voice, but she could not ignore him on the morrow. She must follow up her success, must submit to more boredom, must be ready with fresh compliances and adaptabilities, and all on the bare chance that he might ultimately decide to do her the honor of boring her for life. But it really does feel like sabotage because in her mind she has no viable alternative, and the book is very subtle on this point, on if she does or doesn't have a real alternative under the circumstances. If you're going to read this, the modern library description on the back of this edition is safe, but in general, I would say don't look this book up. I'm glad I didn't know anything about the plot going in. And beyond the plot, the writing is just gorgeous. Like, I had to take breaks in between chapters because I found it too overwhelming, like how stunning it was. I was in actual disbelief about it. It was like the Dirty Fork sketch, but like because the book was too good.
What this? What this?
And I will say, even if you're not sensitive to that kind of thing, when I posted about this on Instagram, Ed at Gagging for Lit commented something like, I've never rooted for a character so hard in my life. And yes, the book has that propulsive element to it too. I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed thinking about the first half of the year as a whole, which is weird phrasing, but the point stands. So thank you for being here, really, thank you. And I'll see you soon for another video.